Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri Markson. Breaking news, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has just announced that Cheng Lei, the Australian journalist detained in China for 3 years, is now free and back in Melbourne. US correspondent Annalise Nielsen, who knows her personally, will join me soon with some exclusive details on this case.
I was able to have a conversation with an Australian citizen, Cheng Lei, who has arrived safely here in Melbourne and has been reunited with her 2 children and her family.
An Israeli father who survived the Hamas slaughter at a music festival where 260 young partygoers were gunned down and killed. He will join me live to tell me how he managed to escape the carnage and when he first knew that something was deeply wrong. And also tonight, while it's difficult to speak about anything at the moment other than Israel, tonight we'll have a sneak peek of the new documentary we've been working on the investigation into the origins of COVID-19. That's coming up a bit later in the show. But first tonight, to the war on Israel and its tangible impact here on the streets of Australia. What I'm about to speak about is distressing for all of us, but it's happening and it's important. Overnight, the most horrific news imaginable. The Israeli Defence Force discovered the bodies of 40 babies and young children. They'd been killed, some even beheaded. Babies found dead next to their cots. The shocking sight of babies and young children with their heads cut off meant that the soldiers who found them and recovered their bodies were seen crying and comforting each other. International media went to one kibbutz with the IDF to examine and record the carnage, and here is a snippet from that report.
Andrey Peairie and her 1-month-old baby escaped her home and survived by hiding in the kibbutz. Her husband, Yahav, disappeared.
Ma. Ma. Ma.
While we filmed, a phone call came. And the news she dreaded. Yahav is dead. This is the horror of war. The family have allowed us to show this so that everyone understands what it is like.
These Hamas terrorists targeted and mutilated the most vulnerable, pregnant women and tiny babies. Jacqueline Magnay in The Australian writes that the atrocities from the Kfar Azar, as well as Kibbutz Be'eri and Kibbutz Re'em, shows that the Hamas militants were intent on brutalising their mass murder spree to leave a deep psychological imprint on those left behind. She writes that in one harrowing image from Kfar Azar, a baby cot with a small dress on the top is drenched in blood. She writes that I-24 news correspondent Nicole Zedek said soldiers had told her that many babies were found next to their cots with their heads cut off. And her colleague, also at Kfar Azar, said we're talking about burned houses with entire families killed inside, women and children whose heads have been cut off. She said it's the apocalypse. Many bodies were still lying in the street. And here's Nicole Zedek breaking down as she describes what she saw.
David, it's hard to even explain exactly just the mass casualties that happened right here. In fact, the Israeli military says they still don't have a clear number, but I'm talking to some of the soldiers and they say what they've witnessed as they've been walking through these different houses, these different communities, babies, their heads cut off. That's what they said. Gunned down, families completely gunned down in their beds. You can see some of these soldiers right now comforting each other.
There truly are no words to capture the evil, the cruelty that would lead these barbarians to take the lives of innocent, tiny, beautiful babies. It is so evil that it's beyond comprehension, beyond belief. These are things you can never imagine people would do to other people. The Australian also reports that deeply worried families have been receiving phone calls from the mobile phones of their loved ones, only to hear men laughing. The Hamas terrorists then boasting about their kills and conquests on social media. It's disgusting. And then there's this Israeli couple who managed to save the lives of their 10-month-old twin babies by hiding them in a safe room. They managed to get their 10-month-old twin babies into that safe room just moments before Hamas terrorists broke down their front door. Itay and Haydar Berdichevsky were brutally murdered, but they'd managed to save the lives of their babies. And it's estimated that around 14 hours later, Israeli soldiers found their tiny twins who'd been left alone for all of that time. And the babies are now being cared for by their grandmother. And those young parents, just 30 years old, are now among 1,200 innocent Israelis who've been killed in this terrorist bloodbath. And 260 of these were young revellers at the Supernova Music Festival. And tonight, one young man who was there would join me live to tell the remarkable story of how he managed to escape. Channel 9 reporter Edward Godfrey went inside one kibbutz next to the Gaza border, and he said no one from this kibbutz has been seen since the attack.
Look, when walking through there were bodies all over the place. It was very, very difficult to see. The smell really stayed with you, and you could just see things abandoned and left where they had been. Cars had been shot up, set on fire. That on the road in, you could see cars there from people who had tried to flee. It's really, it's hard to kind of do it justice trying to describe what we saw and smelled and felt in that place.
Now, unlike Anthony Albanese, United States President Joe Biden has spoken to Benjamin Netanyahu several times in the past few days. He says the Israeli Prime Minister told him the devastating news about babies and families being burned.
They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. Hamas offers nothing but terror and bloodshed with no regard to who pays the price. The loss of innocent life is heartbreaking. Like every nation in the world, Israel has the right to respond, indeed has a duty to respond to these vicious attacks.
14 Americans are among those killed, and so far, at least one Australian. Grandmother Galit Carbone was murdered in her home. Albanese today offering his condolences to her family.
Our sympathies go to the family and loved ones of Ms Carbone. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is providing consular assistance to her family in Israel, but also here in Australia.
All of this trauma is being felt deeply in Australia, of course by the Jewish community here, but also by all Australians who are watching in horror at what's unfolding. The massacre on Saturday was the single day with the highest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. And there's been a sense that some of our political leaders don't quite understand the gravity of this and the way that it's moved and broken the hearts of the Jewish community here and right around the world. Former Prime Minister John Howard today demanded that Anthony Albanese display leadership from the top, and he says that he should stop Labor's poor pussyfooting response to the Hamas terror attack. John Howard called the Opera House protests a catastrophic descent from civility. He said when 9/11 occurred, there was unanimity of response. He says, I was in America, Kim Beazley was leader of the Labor Party, and there wasn't a cigarette paper between us. He completely supported our position. He also told The Australian that this should now be the same. Albanese should make some unequivocal statements, as should the Foreign Minister. John Howard says that instead there is pussyfooting and lukewarm condemnation. He says, and then you have the New South Wales Attorney General, Michael Daly, saying everyone should remain calm and go home. How can you remain calm when demonstrators are invoking the memory of the Holocaust? People remain calm in that. Howard says, I never thought we would crumple to this. We need leadership from the top. We aren't getting that at the moment. If you're a law-abiding Jewish person in Sydney who wanted to go to the Opera House and they told you that you had to stay at home, well, he asks, what is this? Howard asks, there is no room here for moral equivalence when you have people murdering babies. And I played you those Long John Howard grabs because they are powerful comments and they're right. And New South Wales Premier Chris Minns today finally apologised for that despicable Opera House protest where people chanted, "Gas the Jews" and "Death to the Jews." Here's Chris Minns.
The protest organisers have already proven that they're not peaceful. Shouting racial epithets at Jewish community members is not the definition of a peaceful protest. So the idea that they're going to commandeer Sydney streets is not going to happen. And I'm sure the New South Wales Police will make that clear this morning.
Well, the political editor of the Australian newspaper, Simon Benson, well, he writes today that while Albanese hasn't put a foot wrong in the eyes of Jewish leaders, Howard suggests that he has lacked leadership on this issue. And Benson notes that Albanese had initially refused to endorse Bill Shorten's instinctive response to call those Opera House protests anti-Semitic. Of course they were. Albanese later in the day then changed his tune. And look, you'd have to think the reason Albanese's initial response or his heart may not have seemed in it, and you have to say that he shed tears this week, but not for the babies and women and young people who were murdered, but Albanese shed tears this week when he was given a copy of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And you'd have to say that his natural inclination is because he's never been a supporter of Israel. Many, many years ago when he was young, he was one of those at a similar Palestinian protest.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
I say similar, but there was no suggestion that that protest was anti-Semitic like the one that we saw at the Opera House steps on Monday night was. But that was Albanese you saw there on the loudspeaker. It's been widely reported that the Albanese government still hasn't had a National Security Committee of Cabinet meeting on the war on Israel. There are 10,000 Australians in Israel, more in Gaza, and there's a tangible rise in tensions in anti-Semitism on the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. Just on Sunday afternoon, 2 teenage boys were unfurling the Israeli flag on their car. It was a show of solidarity with Israel when a man dressed in high-vis pulled over and he told them, "I'll kill yous all." Amid this abuse, one of the young boys pulled out a phone and he recorded some of the interaction. Have a look at this video that first played on my friend Laura Jays' program earlier today.
Put it back in your car. No, put it back in your car. I swear you're about to use that's like a loser.
And in breaking news, that man, the 23-year-old who threatened to kill those young Jewish teenagers, has handed himself in to Liverpool Police Station and has been arrested. And then in Melbourne, there's reports that a group of men were driving around and they said they were on the hunt for Jews. One of the Melburnians they spoke to said this.
Just had a car full of 4 little Arab boys tell me to wind down my window. They asked me, do you know where any Jews are? I thought they were saying Jules, but they were saying, do you know where any Jews are? I go, nah, don't know where any Jews are, but why? They're like, oh, they'll know what we're going to do with them when we're done with them. And the guy in the back was like, we're on the hunt to kill Jews. This was right now, about 10 minutes ago. Anyway, I've made a report with CSJ, I've made a report with the cops, but these guys look like they were scary. So everyone just look after themselves.
The Jewish security group, the CSG, has now raised the threat level to severe. But Albanese still hasn't held a National Security Committee of Cabinet meeting. Do these rising tensions not matter to him? Do we in the Jewish community not matter to him? He's been in Uluru campaigning for Saturday's Voice referendum, which is all but lost anyway. And British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak took the time to visit a synagogue where he expressed strong support for the Jewish community. Justin Trudeau in Canada also attended a similar Jewish event. Opposition leader Peter Dutton will be attending a vigil for Israel that's being held early this evening. Albanese is not attending that. I understand he's sending Mark Butler. But Albanese finally today, 4 days after the terror attacks happened on Saturday, will be attending a synagogue this evening, we understand. Peter Dutton said he's deeply concerned about the anti-Semitism that's happening right now in Australia.
I thought it was one of the most appalling acts I've ever seen, to turn somebody away who was there to support people of the Jewish community with an Israeli flag at a time when the New South Wales Premier had made a very public statement, and good on him for doing so, in lighting up the Opera House with the Israeli colours. We're hearing stories of young kids who are going to Jewish schools being told not to wear their uniforms in public. Obviously people are worried about the general safety, particularly when you've got abhorrent people yelling to gas the Jews or F the Jews or F Israel.
Now, joining me now live from Israel is a father who was at the Supernova Music Festival when Hamas attacked, killing 260 and gunning down 260 young people and taking many others as hostage. Andrey Peairie, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So important in this tough times to have the support of Australia and from all over the world.
Now, you were at the music festival. You've got 2 young children. What was the first sign that something was amiss?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, it's an electronic musical similar to the Subsonic that you have in Australia. There was thousands of people there. And at around 6:30 a.m., first rocket was shot. And my first thought was, okay, a rocket is shot. The Iron Dome will take care of that. Unfortunately, this is a common situation in Israel, and we're kind of used to that. And then another one, and another one, and another one. And we're close. The party is a couple of miles away. We gathered, we were 4 friends. We gathered together. We crouched on the floor. And the music immediately stopped. The police and the organizers started evacuating everyone. And we were shocked. We were distressed. We didn't know what to do. It's 6:30 a.m., a music festival throughout the night. People drinking and using substances and being under that influence and experiencing that thing is panicking. And from that moment, from around 6:30, we went to the tent and police evacuated us. And we said, none of us can drive. There's going to be a huge traffic jam, and the Iron Dome is taking care of it. So let's wait a bit. And I think that waiting saved our lives for the first time. We gathered all our stuff. We went back to the car, and one of the guys' wife called him, and she said, "Get out of there now. There's terrorists there." I saw it in his eyes. He got us into the car. I do not know how he drove us out of there.
So Andrey, until that point, you didn't realise this was a terrorist attack?
Yeah. It took us around, I think, 40 minutes to that point to understand that there's terrorists there. The first people who exited the party encountered those terrorists. We did not know about them. And once we understood there's terrorists there, we drove out of there off-road. Police closed the road already, turned right on the junction. After about 50 meters, we dropped the windows. After about 50 meters, we heard an explosion. We heard gunfire, people running. We just ditched the car and dropped to the creek. It's in the desert, so it's like a dry creek. And we hid there for about an hour only in my proximity, there were like, I don't know, 30 people. And I'm pretty sure that throughout the creek, there were more. And hiding there, still, like, we cannot function. Physically and mentally, it's hard to function in that situation.
Were you how were you feeling? Were you terrified? Did you understand that there were terrorists all around you?
We heard gunfire from like 180 degrees. We didn't know where it comes from and felt helpless. I have a military background and I know what to do in those situations, but not when I'm in a party feeling the way I'm feeling, and I'm looking for the source of the gunfire. How can I get my hands on a rifle? And then I say to myself, what am I going to do with it? I can't work with it. And we're all panicked. The four of us stayed together. I think that's one of the things that saved our lives. We supported each other. We had a mantra: we're going home today. We're going home today. Mm. And we were there for about an hour, and at one point the bullets grazed the bush that we were hiding. So it's like four of us and like four girls that were by themselves, and we're trying to comfort them in any way we can. And in that moment that we felt the bullets grazing our back, I dove into the bush, and only in that moment I felt that my mind and my body can cooperate, and I can do what I'm thinking of. And so I climbed up.
So how did you?
I climbed out of the creek. Yeah.
Go ahead. How did you end up getting out of there? How did you find a passage to safety?
I climbed out of the creek, crawling up, and I looked at the junction, and it's a horror movie. Everything is on fire. Pickups are driving there. Some guys said that those are the terrorists. I saw Kibbutz Re'im on fire. I knew we can't go to any settlement. We need to run away from there. Tried to get water from the car, but it was too risky to go up. And then I went down and I said to everyone I saw, listen, I'm going out of here. I don't know where I'm going, but we're going away from here. You want to join me? Let's go. And I was torn in that situation. I know how to look at a map. I know what to do, but to take responsibility on those people running somewhere I do not know where I'm going. And a lot of people came with us, and we ran, I think, half a mile. We hid there, called the police. They said, stay tight. We called our friends. They opened maps. They said, we're going to come off-road to pick you up. We said, don't come. You're going to get shot. And eventually it took us about 4.5 hours to get to a road, which was also dangerous, but we decided to go to that road. And the group always mixed. More people came, people left to another direction, and we managed to get to a road. Police car picked us up. Sitting in the police car, we were dreaded because we didn't know. We knew that they kidnapped police cars. And then they took us to a small town called Patish. My sister lives there. We got into her home, and she's on the phone and on her laptop with her kids in the bomb shelter, and she's coordinating all the people from the party. The town had like 700 people come there, and then they took us away on buses.
And were you? Did your wife, who was at home with your two children, know what was happening this whole time?
Yes, definitely. She knew I was at the party. She texted me immediately. In the meantime, she was in the bomb shelter because we live in the Gaza, next to Gaza. So she's in the bomb shelter with the two girls, having an anxiety attack and panicking, and texting. And I'm telling her, I know this is dangerous. I need to focus. It's hard as it is. I need to focus. I love you, and I need to focus on how to get us out of that situation. And I think the four of us being together and supporting each other, that's what helped us to dodge the bullet and to escape that situation.
Well, Andrey Peairie, I'm so relieved you were lucky enough you managed to get yourself and your friends out of harm's way. And I just want you to know that all of us here in Australia, or almost all of us here in Australia, our hearts go out to you, and we're sending our prayers and love and safety to everyone in Israel.
Thank you. Can I add one last thing regarding what you said? Hamas, everyone should know Hamas is ISIS. They're killing in the name of the religion. They're raping. They're burning people alive. They're butchering babies. They're celebrating in the streets. Don't be blind. Open your eyes, see that, okay? They're low lives. They do not respect the laws of war.
All right.
They're terrorists. That's a terrorist organization. Thank you for your support.
Andrey Peairie, thank you so much. Thank you. Now you're seeing live pictures from a synagogue in Melbourne where Anthony Albanese is visiting. Let's go live.
Over 1,000 people in Israel have been killed. As many as 150 taken from Israel and held hostage in Gaza. This is the worst loss of life for Jewish people on a single day since the Holocaust. A fact that bears such awful weight for a people who have known the horror of genocide. The government and the people of Australia unequivocally condemn the attack by Hamas. The targeting of civilians and the taking of hostages is an affront to all Australians, and we condemn these horrific acts. I know that it must have come as such a shock because it wasn't foreshadowed that this would occur. I spoke to the Israeli ambassador to Australia just on Sunday morning, and I'll speak with him again tomorrow morning about the shock that he felt being there, present in Israel while this was unfolding. The images that we've seen from Israel, I believe, have taken a toll on all Australians, I think, find it an affront. But for people from the Jewish community, it is, of course, much heavier, in part because
All right, that was Anthony Albanese speaking live at a synagogue in Melbourne. He took his time, but he finally got to an event to show his support for the Jewish community. Now, let's get straight back into the breaking news now on Cheng Lei, the Australian-Chinese citizen who's been imprisoned in China. News today that she is now free and back in Melbourne. Annalise Nielsen, who knows her, joins me live from Washington. Annalise, thanks so much for your time. I know it's the middle of the night where you are. You've been speaking with Cheng Lei's family, working closely with them. What's been their reaction today? How beautiful was their reunion?
Well, look, we know that she's been reunited with her kids in Melbourne, with the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister there as well. Nick, her partner, I've been speaking to him today, and he said he's almost there, and he's pretty overwhelmed. We didn't know if this was going to happen. We didn't think that this was, honestly, after a while, our best case scenario. We were talking about potentially much longer term, and this has all happened as slowly as it has, quite quickly as well. So we can tell you that Cheng Lei came in on a commercial airline with the ambassador, and you can see him in these photos that have just been released by Foreign Minister Penny Wong's office. And then he flew with her, and it all had to be kept extremely secret until she was back in Australia, because this is just kind of unprecedented what's happened and how it's all panned out. There's a really interesting story to tell in all this, but I've been working on this for 3 years. I've been working very closely with Nick. There's a lot of people who said they would do a lot and didn't, and there's a lot of people who did a lot and didn't say anything about it. And I think that will all come out in the coming weeks, months, years even. But I think at this moment, we just really need to give credit to Penny Wong. She picked this up and ran with it from the first day she came into office, and we've been so grateful for that. And there's obviously a lot more. I can tell you this is all coming out, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but this is just the absolute best case scenario we could have hoped for. And she gets to spend the first night hugging her kids and at home with them, which should have happened a long time ago, but we're really glad it's happening now.
Absolutely. It's devastating that she had to spend 3 years away from her 2 young children. What about the case of Yang Hyung-jun? He's still detained in China. Has there been any word on whether Australia has managed to secure his release as well?
Look, I have no information on that. I'm sorry. I obviously support his case, but we've just been so focused on Cheng Lei, her particular case. As a journalist detained in China, as someone I knew through work contacts, I didn't know her particularly well, but was really upset about how she was being treated, and especially how it seemed like her case was really being forgotten about and ignored. So that's why I started working with Nick to keep it going, and we're just so grateful that we've hit this point.
All right, amazing news. Annalise Nielsen, thank you very much for staying up late to speak to us on this special occasion. On the release of Cheng Lei. Well, after the break, Rowan Dean will join me. We'll speak about how the Albanese government has handled these Hamas terror attacks on Israel. Coming up in a moment. Welcome back. Well, we're going to come back to our coverage of Israel in just a moment. Before we get to that, it's been 3.5 years since the pandemic started, and we still need honest information about why this pandemic happened, why the United States was funding research inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Authorities still don't want to speak about this. We've now produced, to try and address this question, another documentary 2 years after our first one here at Sky News. And in that one, as you know, we interviewed Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, intelligence chiefs. This next documentary, our new one, it's going to air on October 24, 2 weeks from now. It's called What Really Happened in Wuhan, The Next Chapter. In it, one of the people I sat down with was the former head of British spy agency, Sir Richard Dearlove, and he spoke about how the intelligence agencies really tried to silence him when he first raised concerns that COVID-19 had likely been genetically engineered in a Chinese lab.
I believe fundamentally in the freedom of speech, and people were not able to shut me up. But my God, was I unpopular. And, you know, I got a number of privately delivered messages telling me, you know, to stop this. But I feel a complete vindication now because we were right. Or I should say we were very, very probably right. And it's clear where the balance of the evidence lies. And, you know, I still would like to have an explanation from some of these very eminent scientists like Perrin, like Valence, like Whitty, as to why on earth they behaved in the way that they did. I mean, science is meant to be about transparency and explanation. And they acted in a manner which I think was incredibly damaging politically to the reputation of science. So the implications of this go far, far further than just the pandemic.
Okay, let's bring in now Sky News host Rowan Dean to discuss this and then the war on Israel. Rowan, welcome. What do you think that 3 years on we're
Sharri.
still unpicking this extraordinary cover-up when scientists, governments, intelligence agencies tried to shield us from the possibility that COVID came from a lab?
Well, Sharri, well done on the new documentary and well done on the first one. I'm glad you've got Richard Dearlove. I think he's the original M. I think I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure he was one of the original kind of characters that M was based on. And, it did take a James Bond type looking into what was going on in COVID. There were so many weird things about COVID, and you picked on the Wuhan lab, where the virus actually came from, and that's pure James Bond stuff. I mean, some kind of weird Chinese laboratory developing bioweapons and God knows what else. But the key point that Dearlove makes, of course, which is great to hear, is that freedom of speech was sacrificed during COVID on Wuhan and on many, many other things. And I think along with Wuhan, there's the question of the efficacy of the vaccines, there's the question of mandates, there's the question of lockdowns, there's the question of excess mortality. So many things were stifled under the guise of free speech, Sharri, and well done for prizing that open. That needs to be, the light needs to be shone on all these aspects.
Well, we're going to have dual congratulations now because the reason I wanted you on the program is because you had such an extraordinary editorial on Outsiders on Sunday morning about Israel and how the left has been treating Israel over all these years. Now revelations this week in The Australian that there has been a lacklustre response from some senior cabinet ministers in the Albanese government towards these, some of the most appalling attacks we've ever seen in our lives that have just happened in Israel, babies being beheaded. And we just haven't seen that sort of strong condemnation from some cabinet ministers. What's going on here? What do you think of the government's response?
Well, I think the government's response has been shocking, not surprising, but so lukewarm and pathetic. On Saturday night, when we were all horrified by the images that were coming up on social media, we were putting together the Outsiders show for the Sunday morning. We put in many hours of work to do that. The Prime Minister's office had to be asked by James Morrow for a comment from the Prime Minister of Australia about what was happening, and none was forthcoming till the following morning. I mean, how appalling is that to begin with? Penny Wong came out with the usual foreign minister stuff about restraint, Israel showing restraint. Restraint? How do you show restraint when women are being gang raped, burnt alive, tortured, having their limbs broken, paraded around and spat on by barbarians? How do you show restraint in the light of that? So from the two top figures of the Albanese government, we got very, very poor, inadequate responses. Okay, we're now several days later, and okay, good, well done, Albo. You're at a service, terrific. But there's no passion behind Labor, and we certainly haven't heard, or I don't believe we've heard, from those two ministers, Tony Burke and Chris Bowen, who are the MPs for Western Sydney, where we can assume, rightly or wrongly, that many of those so-called demonstrators, they weren't demonstrators, on Monday evening. On Monday evening, we saw images that should shame all Australians, images that went all around the world of the Opera House. The one thing most people in the world know, pretty much the only thing the rest of the world knows about Australia, is the Opera House, the Bridge and the Rock.
Exactly.
To have the Opera House turned was a consecrated memorial for that evening for all Australians, and particularly Jewish Australians, to have somewhere to focus their grief at the barbarity that had been perpetrated upon women, children and others. To have that memorial desecrated by an angry mob of inciting hatred and inciting death to Jews was shocking. We need arrests, we need convictions, and we need deportations.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Thank you so much for your support and for your strong words, Rowan Dean. Really appreciate it. Now, coming up, Andrew Charlton and Bridget McKenzie will join me. We'll talk about Qantas chairman Richard Goyder finally resigning. That's next. All right, let's bring in tonight's political panel, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and Labor MP for Parramatta Andrew Charlton. Welcome to you both. Bridget, news today that Qantas chairman Richard Goyder will be stepping down. Do you think this is going to make a noticeable difference?
Well, it absolutely will. The share market will be watching Mr Goyder's move. He's obviously got a lot of experience, but the share price has been going in the wrong direction as a result of not just his leadership, the board more generally, and particularly the former CEO, Alan Joyce. Qantas needs to restore its reputation to its loyal customers, its staff, shareholders and the broader public. We need a smooth transition of board and management positions to actually restore that reputation so Qantas can once again be an airline all Australians can be proud of.
I mean, Andrew, Alan Joyce as CEO, he got a lot of the blame publicly for all of Qantas's many failings this year. But do you think Richard Goyder is just as much to blame?
Well, ultimately, Richard Goyder and the board are accountable to Qantas's owners and investors. And that's why Mr Goyder has announced his retirement today, and that retirement will take effect next year. I think Mr Goyder is trying to get a balance between accountability for Qantas's mistakes and also providing stability at a time when Qantas has already had its CEO depart and some other senior leaders leave the business. So I think that's what's behind the announcement today of a retirement announced now but not taking effect for another year.
All right, let's talk about The Voice. It's quite amazing that we've got to this point. It's Wednesday. The Voice referendum is on Saturday, 3 days out. According to the Resolve strategic poll for the Sydney Morning Herald, support for The Voice among Indigenous groups has fallen. But according to this poll, it is still in the majority. Apparently, it's 59% are in favour. Bridget, this is much lower than the Prime Minister's often quoted 80%.
Exactly. I mean, so I'm not going to commentate on the Prime Minister's statistics that he's using. I can tell you I've been on pre-poll today, up and down Wodonga Main Street in my no T-shirt and getting a lot of quiet nods from a whole spectrum of local community members here in regional Victoria. So I do think whether it's the Indigenous Australians voting figures or more broadly, the fall of support for The Voice is because people haven't been able to understand, the government's been unwilling to explain, and Australians are rightfully, quietly, in their own respectful way, saying no right across the board. And that's just been my experience out on the booths today.
What about in your area? You're in Parramatta in Western Sydney, Andrew. I mean, obviously you've been out door knocking. What's your sense on the ground? Are you also getting a lot of people saying, no, not interested?
Look, first of all, let me just address your question to Bridget. It is absolutely wrong and disingenuous to suggest that Indigenous people do not support The Voice to Parliament. Indigenous people supported The Voice to Parliament right through the Uluru dialogues, which involved more than 1,000 Indigenous people leading up to the Uluru Statement, which endorsed.
There's more than 1,000 Indigenous Australians in the country. Sorry,
but Andrew, this is a Sydney Morning Herald represents. Go ahead, Andrew.
Sorry, you're going to let me finish, Bridget. Secondly, it's also been supported by major Indigenous organisations, including the Northern Territory Land Council, the Kimberley Land Council, and many others. Thirdly, any of the published polls you look at show strong majority support for The Voice to Parliament. So whichever way you cut this, Indigenous people are positive and support The Voice, and it's disingenuous to suggest anything else.
So do you think this poll is wrong? Because this is a poll in the Sydney Morning Herald that says it is still the majority, but they're saying around only 59% of Indigenous Australians plan to vote yes.
Well, polls go up and down, but whether it's 59% or 80%, it is a strong majority of Indigenous people that support The Voice. I'm not going to put any particular weight or opposition on any individual poll, but there is no question that across the history of this proposition, including today, Indigenous people strongly support The Voice to Parliament.
Yeah. What do you think, if it does fail, as the polls are pointing to, Bridget, do you think the opposition is going to start to put pressure on the Prime Minister and blame him for this and claim that he's divided the country?
Well, Sharri, he has.
Well, first of all,
I mean, the Karma Langton report outlined a whole process to get to a voice, and it didn't include going to a referendum before regional voices were set up and local voices, etc., and that there had been time and process and a coming together and an agreement of the broader Australian public. Instead, Albo and his ego drove us to this referendum within the first term of his parliamentary prime ministership, and it's been a disaster on the ground. It has divided our country, and I'm someone that's tried to participate in this debate very respectfully as someone that is absolutely committed to reconciliation.
Yeah,
but
all right.
How this has been conducted on both sides has been appalling.
All right, Andrew Charlton, Bridget McKenzie, I apologise. We had breaking news tonight, so we are now out of time, but thank you both so much for joining me. And as we try to come to terms with the fresh horror out of Israel, I'll be joined next by the Israeli embassy here in Australia. Welcome back. Well, joining me now is Ilana Lenk, the head of public diplomacy at the Embassy of Israel. Ilana, thank you so much for joining me. Look, just devastating news overnight that the IDF has discovered 40 babies and young children beheaded, their heads cut off. I mean, how can this cruelty have taken place?
Well, Sharri, thank you for having me here today. Definitely the images and the news stories coming out of Israel are horrifying. They continue to come, and we haven't seen pictures like this in many, many years. I have never seen pictures like this in my lifetime. I don't know what kind of cruel animals would slaughter children, would slaughter families, would wipe them off the map, and leave people burnt to death in their homes, in their beds, and it is definitely horrifying to see.
Yeah, I think, any of us, even if you're not Jewish, everyone I've spoken to today is just beyond horrified. The victims, tiny babies shot and decapitated just for being Jewish. I mean, the little body bags that we've seen the images of is beyond the pale. You can't actually comprehend how anyone could behave like that. Ilana, what about your personal connections? You've got friends and family members who are now being called up to serve, to fight for Israel.
That's correct. The IDF has called huge numbers of reserve soldiers to help with this situation, both in the south of Israel and around the country. My cousin is fighting right now in Kfar Aza, so that same kibbutz, the same neighborhood where those bodies have been found overnight. He is there as we speak, and the IDF is working tirelessly in order to protect Israeli civilians.
So when you say he's fighting in one of those kibbutzes, there's still live combat going on there? It's not the case that the terrorists are out of Israel yet?
As of now, the situation is contained, and there are no longer terrorist attacks happening within southern cities. From my understanding, the soldiers are there to contain the situation and, of course, are preparing for anything in the near future.
So I think the next step and the question that we're all asking is, how does Israel plan to bring home some of those 160 women, children, families who have been taken hostage?
Well, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces' main objective is to protect our citizens and retrieve any hostages that have been taken. The Israeli Defense Force has not stopped working for the last 5 days, and of course prior to that, and will not stop until we return all of our Israeli citizens back to our territory.
And is this the priority? So will the plans to completely crush Hamas be put on hold until you have those families, those innocent civilians home? I mean, how do you balance those competing priorities?
Well, the Israeli Defense Force has stated very clearly that its priority going into this is to destroy Hamas's capabilities and to make sure they will no longer be able to attack Israeli civilians. I think they go hand in hand, and Israel will do its very best in order to contain the situation, to fight the fight that we did not start and we did not want. But it is a war that we will win.
Just very quickly before you go, you're living in Australia at the moment. You would have seen the violent, aggressive, horrible protests that were at the Opera House. What's your reaction to that level of anti-Semitism in Sydney, Australia?
Well, seeing those images coming out of Sydney are obviously pretty appalling. The chants that were heard there haven't been heard in a while, and of course we condemn them to the highest of our abilities. I don't know what there is to celebrate. I really don't. To go out to the streets and celebrate the killing, the burning, the murdering of families, children. The pictures are just horrifying, and I would not understand what there is to celebrate. I mean,
absolutely.
Please, I would love to hear it.
Absolutely nothing. Ilana Lenk, thank you very much for your time. I'll see you 5 o'clock tomorrow, and here's Peter Credlin.